This is the second video devoted to the Suite in G minor by Jean-Henri d'Anglebert. In this video, I will be discussing and performing the remaining four movements of the suite, namely the Sarabande, the Gigue, the Gaillarde, and the Passacaille. I want to discuss the Sarabande and the Gigue from the standpoint of achieving dynamic gradations on the harpsichord. This is an issue I feel is still misunderstood nowadays, and while the situation is gradually changing for the better, the mistaken perception that you cannot achieve dynamic contrasts on a harpsichord continues to persist. I have already made a video showing how such a claim is incorrect. Link in the video description. But I think a big part of the problem lies in the fact that there are some fundamental differences in creating dynamic contrasts on a harpsichord compared to a piano. So if a performer approaches the harpsichord the same way they would approach a modern piano, then indeed a lot of the harpsichord's potential for dynamic gradations will be lost. On a responsive instrument, you can create subtle dynamic changes depending on how you pluck a string. Of course, you can achieve dynamic changes by using different registrations, for example, switching between manuals or coupling the manuals, in other words, playing both of them at the same time, or adding the forefoot stop. But these are more fixed changes that also involve a change in timbre. So to me, they only have expressive power in isolated situations. What I think is the most crucial component in achieving dynamic gradations has to do with how you utilize the resonance of the instrument. At a very basic level, this can mean that the more notes you play together, the louder the instrument will sound. But more importantly, it means that phrasing and articulation are essential elements in creating subtle dynamic changes and thus playing expressively on a harpsichord. And again, at a slightly more advanced level than simply playing more notes and making more noise, I could say something like this. Let's say we have two notes. If I play them like this, they sound the same. But if I hold the first note onto the second note, you notice that I am doing a slight decrescendo. Let me play both of these at the same time so you can hear them better. And perhaps slightly more obvious is if I had something like this. Notice again, I'm going to play the notes individually so that the low F is quite loud. And now I'm going to hold the notes so that the F is tapered off a little bit because the other notes continue to sound while I play that F. And this is what creates that slight tapering off. Again. Another crucial consideration is that when it comes to harpsichord music, we are almost always dealing with composers who were themselves harpsichordists and were thus intimately familiar with the capabilities of the instrument. This means that dynamics are oftentimes already written in the music itself, because these composers knew exactly how to create dynamic gradations with the way they wrote their music. So what I would like to do now is look at the Sarabande and then the Gigue and show you a couple of examples of written in dynamics. Let's start with the Sarabande, and more specifically, I want to play the very opening of the piece, where Danglebert is going to create a dynamic crescendo by progressively moving lower and lower in the harpsichord's range, where the harpsichord tends to sound a little louder. So you will notice that the sound is actually increasing also because we're moving to the very bottom of the harpsichord. In other words, we're reaching the lower limits of the instrument. Even that in itself is going to create a certain tension. So this is also part of creating this kind of dynamic crescendo. And you notice that when we get that very low G, this is the high point of the phrase. And this is, I think, very obviously written in the music. He's really planned it that way. And it's also very nice that if I were to continue, then he kind of lets off a little bit. So we've left that lower range now and we've moved a little further up. So we don't have that kind of louder, more imposing sound. Again, let me play the opening four measures one more time. So one example here in the Sarabande of a written-in type of dynamic crescendo. Let's move now to the Gigue. And because the music that I want to show you is a little more extended, what I'm going to do is I want to show you the score. I will show you a modern edition, and I will tell you exactly what is happening in terms of dynamics. Now, what I really want to discuss about the Gigue concerns the entire first section. And what I want to do here is simply identify what is happening, and then I think you will be able to appreciate it a lot more when you listen to the entire first section during the complete performance. Also, because the first section occupies an entire page in a modern edition, I can't show you all of it, so let's start with the first two lines. And what I want you to notice here is basically the kind of rhythmic identity that we see. And if you look at these first two lines, I would say that the fastest note value that predominantly appears, not necessarily the fastest one, but the one that's more predominant, is the eighth note. So, and we're going to start slightly more slowly in terms of rhythmic activity. So we have this. Etc., etc. So we basically have eighth notes in terms of what is the predominant fastest value in these two lines. Now let's move to lines 3 and 4. So now we're very, very close. You see pretty much everything but the very last measure of the first section. And what I want you to notice here is that suddenly we have a proliferation, shall we say, of 16th notes that is beginning to happen in measure 6. And what is happening here is that Danglebert is increasing the rhythmic activity of this section. Now, I can't play this up to tempo and talk at the same time, so forgive me if I play it a little more slowly. So we start this way. And here's where we have a faster rhythmic motion now. And now, at this point, notice that the 16th notes are going to be taken up by the left hand, and not only that, but we are very low at the range of the harpsichord, meaning that again there is a lot more noise happening here. So not only are we at a fairly loud range of the harpsichord itself, but we also have quite a lot of notes. So notice how the sound is going to get louder here. So if you were to play this entire section complete, you would notice that we are slowly increasing not just the rhythmic activity, but the actual dynamic of the piece. So Danglebert has really written in a dynamic crescendo that extends from the very beginning of the section to the very end of the section. For the Gaillarde, Danglebert includes the indication lentement, in other words, slowly. For me, in addition to the choice of an appropriate tempo, something that will enhance a sense of lentement is the overall rendering of the musical gestures and the ornamentation. What I mean by this is that the various gestures in the piece need to be performed in an unhurried manner, and what is arguably even more challenging in a piece filled with an imaginative array of ornamentation, the ornaments also need to be performed slowly. I would suggest thinking of them as vocal ornaments and performing them as if you were singing them. And also let an ornament occupy as much of the time frame allotted to it. Such an approach will also aid in bringing out the lyricism and fragility of the piece. Let me show you what I mean by this by playing the very opening. And again, we have something like this. So notice that I'm just playing all these ornaments kind of slowly, almost lazily, one could say. Instead of and again. And so on. So I'm trying to take as much time as I can. However much time I have to play the ornament, I try to take the entire time. In the Sarabande and the Gigue, I showed how Danglebert can create a dynamic crescendo by exploiting the resonance of the lower register of the harpsichord and by increasing rhythmic activity. In the Gaillarde, by contrast, he introduces a sense of dynamic urgency by having the melody soar higher and higher until it reaches a high C, this particular one, which is only a fourth below the very highest note of F. This creates a palpable tension in the sound because we're so close to the upper limit of the instrument. Now, I've already played the beginning a little bit, but let me play it again. And notice how the melody is going to keep soaring. And again, we get this idea, this notion of dynamic urgency and almost a dynamic crescendo, because we're reaching the upper limits of the instrument. And this does create a certain tension. how we're going to keep going higher and higher. And now we are kind of gradually decrescendoing. And all of this is achieved really by exploiting the different registers of the harpsichord. Let's turn now to the Passacaille, which for me is one of the most magnificent pieces in all of Baroque literature. Before we discuss some of its features, it is important to understand how it is structured, because it's a little different compared to the textbook Passacaille form most listeners are familiar with. According to this textbook definition, a Passacaille consists of a repeating bass pattern with the melodic content above it changing with every iteration of the bass pattern, kind of like a series of melodic variations over a repeating bass line. Arguably, one of the best known pieces that adheres to this form is Bach's Passacaille in C minor, BWV 582, which also follows another convention of the genre, namely that it begins with a statement of the bass pattern played on its own, without any musical material above it, something that helps the listener identify the pattern and makes it easier to keep it in mind as the piece unfolds. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with it. It's this one. And I don't have a low C, so it ends there. The typical French Baroque Passacaille does not exactly work this way, because while you can still think of it as a series of variations, the bass pattern is constantly transformed so that the overall narrative is much less predictable compared to a textbook Passacaille like the one by Bach. This is not to suggest there is no unifying thread, but it is usually located at the harmonic level, so it's more subtle and not necessarily always constantly present. In other words, we're dealing with a much more unpredictable and fluid structure, and every Passacaille is going to establish its own unique narrative. I believe that the inspiration to use this more fluid way of writing Passacailles comes from a slightly older Italian tradition that French composers would have been familiar with. About 3 years ago, I posted a video entitled Two Italians in Paris, link in the video description, in which I played two pieces, one by Frescobaldi and one very likely by Luigi Rossi, that appear in the Boin manuscript. The Rossi piece is indeed a Passacaille and displays the same kind of fluidity we find in French Passacailles, with the bass line being constantly transformed. Incidentally, Rossi had also spent some time in Paris, and his opera Orfeo was premiered there in 1647. Now, let's look at the d'Anglebert Passacaille. As I mentioned before, despite the constant transformations we find in a French Passacaille, there usually is a unifying thread. In this particular one, the unifying thread is a trope we find in many Passacailles, including the one by Rossi that appears in the Boin manuscript, and that is a descending minor tetrachord. And what I mean by this, since this particular one is in G minor, the descending minor tetrachord would be this. So we kind of start in the tonic, and go down to the dominant. By using it here, Danglebert provides a unifying thread both for this piece as well as the entire suite, since this minor tetrachord is also present in other movements, something I discussed in the previous video devoted to this suite. Now, there are a few things I would like to mention about this Passacaille. So, first of all, let's start with the fact that unlike the Bach Passacaille that I played before, this one does not start simply with the bass pattern on its own. In other words, we start right away with both the right hand and the left hand playing at the same time. So this is one complete statement of the bass line plus what is happening in the right hand. And what I wanted to say first of all is that we have a total of 20 variations, and each one of these is repeated. In other words, what would happen right after I played this, we would go back and we would hear it once more. The normal length of each of these variations is 4 measures, and each chord usually occupies about 1 measure, but not all variations conform to that, although most of them do. So now, what is the bass pattern? As I said, we have this. And if you listen to the left hand, so it is in there. We go to E natural first, but then here's our E flat. So the descending tetrachord. Now, the second variation actually makes it a little clearer. So if I were to continue and play the second variation, here the bass line is a little clearer. And as you can see, what is happening, you can see this even from these first 2 variations, is that the left hand does not remain the same, but the harmonic content of it remains pretty much the same. Another thing that I would like to mention is that the bass line is going to get a little more rhythmically animated during the final variations. And so the tetrachord itself is going to become a little more obscure, but it is still going to be there. So if I were to go to one of the final variations, and just to give you an idea now of what the left hand is going to sound like, I'm going to play both hands together. So again, just as an example of what you're going to see as we're getting towards the end of the piece. One more feature that I would like to briefly mention, and this is something that I think it's a little more complicated and it would really take too much time to go through all of this, is that I think there is also variation at the level of the ornamentation itself. And what I mean by this is that if you listen to the piece carefully and listen to it more than once, you are probably going to notice that there are certain ornaments that seem to appear in specific places, then maybe we hear a little more of them, and then they kind of again go away, let's say, they recede in the background, and then a different type of ornament comes more into prominence. As I mentioned, this is a little complicated. I don't know how much I'm reading into this, but to me it seems that even ornaments are kind of treated as if they were motivic ideas that are developed a little bit. So let me show you an example of this. So there is a particular type of ornament that Danglebert uses, and it sounds something like this. I will just play the first instance of it that I see on this page. It's this one. So we have, it's kind of a trill with a little termination. It's one that we have not seen up to this point in the piece, but we see it here, and this is its first instance. Now, we're going to hear it just once in this variation, so at this particular spot. But then, when we get to the next variation, we hear it once here, and once more here. So what I mean by this is that we hear it once, then suddenly in the next variation it appears twice, and if I were to go to the next variation, then we just hear it once more, so right here. And then it kind of goes away. In other words, if I look at the rest of the piece, it doesn't appear anymore. So it seems as if he has a certain collection of ornaments, and those also seem to appear in particular moments. They seem to be highlighted in particular moments of the piece, and then they recede in importance, while a different type of ornament comes more into prominence. So there are a lot of different levels of organization in this piece, but at any rate, it is a piece that definitely rewards repeated listening. As always, thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoy the performance. Thank